Okay, so good afternoon again, everyone, and welcome to the launch of Precarious Power, Compliance and Discontent under RAMAPHOSA'S ANC by Susan Booysen. We're delighted to have a lot of participants in this launch this afternoon. I thought that we'd just start off by explaining some of the rules about the launch, and then I will go ahead and introduce the speakers, and then we'll hand over to the author and Prof. Torbo. So just briefly, I'm the publisher at Wits University Press, and this is the third book of Susan Booysen's that we're publishing. So it's a great delight to host this online launch as well. Unfortunately, we can't do it in person, but that's how these things work nowadays. The book, of course, is available for sale through all your favorite bookshops, online bookshops, and so on. And please do contact us if you have any problems getting hold of it. So thanks again for joining us. This will be a 1-hour launch. We'd like to welcome people from various mailing lists, including our Facebook audience. After the discussion by Susan and Zukisi Tobo about the book, you will have an opportunity for question and answer, which you can do via the chat button on at the bottom of the screen. And Facebook audience can use the comment section for questions, which will be shared with the facilitator, Lerato, who will then send these on to the panelists. Please also make sure, I think you are all muted, in fact. And if you have any live questions that you want to ask, Lerato will do the same thing and unmute you so you can ask your question. Finally, this webinar is being recorded and it will be shared on the Wits School of Governance YouTube channel if you want to have a look at it later. So let me briefly introduce the panelists. So I'm sure Susan Booysen does not need any introduction. She's a political scientist, author, and analyst. She works at the Wits School of Governance, or is a visiting professor there. As I mentioned, this is her third book published through Wits University Press, and she is, of course, the author of numerous articles, book chapters, and so on. Please join me in welcoming Prof. Susan Booysen. And in conversation with her today will be Professor Zukisi Tobo of the Wits School of Governance. He serves on President Cyril Ramaphosa's Economic Advisory Council. In the past, he was Chief Director responsible for developing South Africa's trade policy at the Department of Trade and Industry, and he also sits on the board of Corruption Watch. Thanks so much, Susan and Zukisi, for speaking this afternoon. I'm now going to hand over to the two of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronica, for that lovely introduction, and thanks for being a partner in this launch. We're very thrilled to be working with the Wits University Press in bringing this launch event to the wider public. I'd like to welcome you all to this launch. I'm very thrilled about this launch, having presided over the first Susan's first book a couple of years ago. I read this book, and I feel fortunate to have been one of the very first recipients to read it for this discussion. It is a highly enjoyable book. It is not stuck to the idea that all the problems we have in South Africa or in the ANC are due to Zuma. It certainly takes our eyes beyond the Zuma years to contend with the challenges that are plaguing the Ramaphosa's leadership. Precarious Power, that's the title of the book, Ramaphosa's Precarious Power. She also takes a critical look to what she refers to as a loose network of opposition that is diverse and largely uncoordinated and operates in the policy and governance space. Also takes a jab at what she calls the informalized or personalized power that Ramaphosa organizes, and I felt a little offended because in my advisory role I am part of this I'm part of this network, but not quite. In this sense, Susan opens the veil to the operation of state power, the factional dynamics within the party as they evolve, and the workings of the state and Ramaphosa's own imprints on the state, the emergence of a new protest culture, and how it inscribes itself in policymaking and governance. So she forces us to really think about governance beyond the formal political structures and to understand different ways in which power is diffused and how the civic sphere can have a shaping influence on our understanding, or at least on the constitution of governance and public policy. This work is really unique in that that is unique in the broader canvas of writings on current affairs, in that it's not opinion driven. It's heavily research driven. It's careful in other parts, and it marshals evidence. It does not allow itself to fall into the trap of making broad assertions without substantiation. So it makes it really a credible work, and it's lovely that Suzanne, you've taken time to undertake interviews, field research, talk to players in the policy space, in the policy making space, actors in governance. So to really start off with, I would like to ask you just to take us, as a way to open, take us through the process of putting this work together, the writing process, what motivated you to focus on this theme, to embark on this project, what did you seek to achieve, as well as talk a bit about the major theme that holds this work together. Over to you, Suzanne. You mute.
Thank you very much. Principle 101. Thanks, Mizu, for the introduction. And thank you, Veronica. Thank you, Wits University Press. I truly appreciate you having you as a partner and you coming along all the way with me through 3 books, Generation of Political Power, Dominance and Decline, and now Precarious Power, all centering on political power. And thank you to Just Hoover's School of Governance for partnering in this event. I truly appreciate it. And to all the participants, so many of you, I think you are from around all time zones around the globe. Welcome, thank you very much. Thank you, friends, colleagues, family. I appreciate your presence here very much. And Mizu, I appreciate this challenging opening questions. Yeah, I think almost every South African, I was intrigued and I remain intrigued with how the ANC, 109-year-old movement, party nowadays, 27 years in power, amongst so many problems afflicting it, but remains standing, retains its grip on political power and retains a formidable ability to absorb the pressures in it and around it. I hope to explore and understand this question much better. And that is really what drove me in this research. And apart from the ANC being such a fascinating topic and subject, in that sense of the words, word to study, It is truly never a dull moment. So as I say in the preface, thank you very much for the ANC for continuing to provide riveting material to analyze and to research. And Mizzou, indeed, I have done meticulous research. I love my research, and in this case too, the whole range of from analyzing documents, from doing observations at media briefings, at conferences, to doing interviews selectively. And I might add, if anybody wonders why they have not been interviewed, I tend to focus my interviews on people who are not trying to mislead me through interviews, and put all the information, the data together and reflect on it and live with my research data and hopefully derive some insights. And I think overall in this book, and as in the previous books, the Regeneration of Political Power, ANC, and my first book, that set out 4 pillars of political power: ANC organisationally, people and elections, protests and people, the state, including policy, etc. And these pillars remain the centers around which I position my analysis. But across these 4 pillars of ANC political power, which provides a useful framework, I also became aware increasingly how the ANC uses supplementary or parallel streams of political action, some by design, some absolutely not, some arising by default, but often, not always, helping the ANC to retain and build this power. And I became struck with how consistently, whenever one isn't too sure what is really happening in South African politics and in ANC politics, one starts looking at what other layers, concurrent layers of politics are unfolding continuously, perhaps informing what we see on the surface, what we see on this officially recognized pristine multi-party democracy, consolidated multi-party democracy that we like to describe South Africa has. And amongst these layers, streams, I also see a huge amount of informalization. And that we see that in the context of definitely ANC and elections, where so much of discontent with ANC, and that certainly is there, is not pushed into formal party politics, is not pushed into opposition party politics. Opposition parties frequently really do not benefit from that discontent that does exist with the ANC. And we ask the question, why? How is this happening? But we simultaneously see, and that helps explain, how the ANC can persevere after so many years in power and after so many problems being experienced in power. But let me go a little more systematically through these 4 phases or pillars of political power that the ANC has. I've already started referring to elections. Of course, the voters really got a good deal in 2019. They voted for by ANC, but they really voted for more than one political party. The ANC had this different layers of action in it, the different camps or the different factions. Many people say, what is this preoccupation with factions? It's so natural in party politics the world over, and I agree with that. It is very, very pervasive, however, in ANC. It drives so much activity. It drives so much of the contest. And in South Africa, we are really so centered. We continue to be centered around the ANC that we easily replace inter-party contests with intra-party contests. And some of the intra-party contests, and we'll talk more about that later, Mizzou, but some of the intra-party contests that we see unfolding now are really substitute in a popular mind in matters that really matter in South African politics, a substitute for inter-party contestation. And yes, so that is also confirmation that these battles that are unfolding, whether they constitute serious challenges or not to Ramaphosa and RAMAPHOSA'S in the ANC, but they constitute a real part, an important part in this contest that often replaces inter-party contests. And yes, that brings us to the point too, that there are really many different ANCs. As former ANC struggle stalwart James Nkakula once told me in an interview, thank you for that, that there are many different ANCs. There are enough ANCs for almost everybody who used to belong or still belong to the ANC to find their corner in the ANC. Sometimes they're pushed onto the margins, sometimes in the center, but he pointed out to me that there are just so many different ANCs in there. And that is different from being ANC, being a big tent for all diverse political opinion. That is a structural, really a structural, virtual, real structural formation in the ANC. And of course, that is also part of the point that not all of these parallel structures are by design or with a view to put in place with a view to retaining power. They're often de facto, involuntary, and very often not by design. And so much in the ANC depends on the leadership and those leadership's profiles. And that is also the great strength that Cyril Ramaphosa has had, and that the pollsters, those ones who could amid COVID still conduct solid opinion polls, they would affirm that Cyril Ramaphosa, whether people hate him or love him in the ANC, is really still that pillar that brings in popular ratings. We know that the ANC and Cyril Ramaphosa himself have had very high ratings for how they've been handling government and the COVID crisis in the time of the COVID crisis. We know that Cyril Ramaphosa's standings at the time of Nasrec 2017 was a big part of the reason why he was voted in, even if it was by that marginal 179 vote majority. And that is because he could help the ANC, because of his popular standings, rise above, be assured, literally assured, of an electoral outcome come 2019 that would be above that 50% outright majority. And that is how intra-ANC, these organizational dynamics work out in relation to elections. Of course, Ramaphosa his presidency is characterized by that pledge that he made at Nasrec, that he would work for the unity of the ANC. And that's where that leadership really comes out, and many questions are raised. Is he as strong a leader as some people suggest he is? Is his long game really a hiding behind not being able to give that leading from the front to make sure that a certain kind of ANC, a cleaner, less corrupt one, is being asserted? And his leadership, therefore, still leaves many questions which perhaps we can explore later on. But he certainly has to live with that pledge he made at Nasrec, that he would work for the unity of the ANC. And whenever we see a statement, for example, of the ANC's NEC being issued, it is almost guaranteed that there will be the statement by Ramaphosa and reiteration by Ramaphosa that unity is paramount. And that, of course, is very restraining in how much he can achieve. Inside the ANC, where it fuses with the state, we find that fusion with the state as a big, big source of power for the ANC. And that's why the ANC cannot afford to split, cannot afford to lose elections in the sense of perhaps remain the strongest 50% plus close to it party, at least the strongest party, but not have that 50% plus majority, because it will lose control over so many other state institutions. And whether it's by deployment and positions, or contracts and public procurement, or just public development that are beneficial and show at the affirmation of ANC policies. It's all very important for the ANC to retain that kind of contract within the control, within the state. But we know that things in the state do not always go well. There are many supplementary parallel organizations, formations, additional state institutions in the state. And yes, indeed, there are so many consultative advisory bodies. Some were inherited from previous presidential regimes in the ANC, others were new ones. And it really helps Ramaphosa to take decisions, also through courts and commissions, where he's often not strong enough to take those decisions. Then we can see that help he gets through courts and commissions. And of course, and I also write about that in the book, there is the effort, the campaigns to delegitimize the judiciary. In the state too, we see that when things do not go well, for example, in the state security services, in different security formations, there can be add-ons, new emphases, new people being brought in many cases, but there can also be commissions, and through those, some decisions can be taken or resources can be found. Also inside the presidency, many new people are added on, presidency, cabinet, when the old guard cannot be pushed out because they may create more power, more problems outside, then power is bolstered inside by getting the numbers bigger. The cabinet could not be shrunk drastically, largely because of that as one of the reasons. We even see that in local government in South Africa. ANC retains power overwhelmingly, even if in some metros, and there's a story of its own in the metros and the coalitions that were formed there. But local government, when that doesn't work and it's so dysfunctional, but a new development, we've seen a district development model being brought in a hope to supplement, to replace, to push power away from largely dysfunctional local government structures, so that there can be functionality and the state under the ANC can perhaps be seen to be functioning better. And the fourth of these phases or pillars of political power, that in which we also see demonstrated how the ANC bolsters or retains, sustains its power through these different dimensions and tiers that often run parallel, is in the relation to the people and protest. It's such a fascinating phenomenon, and much research has been done on that relationship between the ballot and the brick. So voting for the ANC, but also protesting against the ANC. It's a fascinating field. Largely that relationship prevails. So many communities may be protesting against the ANC, against government, ANC government, and yet when election time comes, they either then reaffirm some form of support through a vote for the ANC, or they stay away, but often just do not give that vote to the ANC. So we see this relationship, this symbiotic relationship between the ANC and the people. We also, of course, see it in the context of the state, where even if people are very, very critical of corruption, of capture, they still see a type of parent state there who will bring the food back home, to quote from some of the research interviews that I've done, and that will look after its people. So they see a close relationship with the ANC continuously, even if they're also very critical. And this is also closely related to the ANC's projection, continuous projection, often with good reason, on good grounds, as the liberation icon and that the struggle continues to unfold. The ANC is excellent at retaining that narrative of liberation from apartheid, colonialism, colonial racialism, racism, etc. And ANC takes great care to retain that image and to honor struggle heroes continuously and to pay tributes wherever possible, to keep that link with a very strong race dimension, very strong. And that works for so many other people, even if they are very critical. They do not move to other political parties, and especially not to political parties that do not have an acceptable racial profile. So discontent is not channeled into elections, is often expressed through protest, but it is not a static relationship. Of course, that can differ, can change over time, and it has been changing over time as well. But that strong bond and a direct bond, often a direct relationship, indirect action, again, between ANC and people, constituencies out there. That stands very strong in the ANC's repertoire of still remaining standing so many years into government. So we also see, of course, a lot of populism and direct action when we get to policy. Policy is often asserted in South Africa through protest, public policy I'm talking about. We can look at land, we can look at xenophobia, de facto policy on xenophobia. If we look at truck protests and targeting of non-South African truck drivers, for example, we can look at urban land, indeed very valid, legitimate urban hunger, and especially in times of COVID, but also long before that, how land can be occupied by the ANC, also because it has a certain sense of guilt about a big liberation deficit, not having been able to deliver on all the basic human rights and associated services that was supposed to have been coming automatically with the liberation epoch. They are very aware of it. The ANC is very aware of it. And then also supplement through it, for example, through application of soft law. In the book, I write about the case study, and I do many case studies. Much of my research centers around case studies, and I've just selected a few for inclusion in this book. But we, for example, not just see something like e-tolls and people claiming taking policy. Doesn't matter what the official state and officially stated policy is, there is a de facto real policy that is playing out around us. We see that in fees must fall that happened there. We see it in land claiming and land occupation. In service, claiming services. There is soft law in application and enforcement of law around that. Also because the ANC does not wish to alienate its followers, alienate people who justifiably can ask for more and can ask for services, can ask for land, can ask for rights to housing. And so there is the soft law approach that the ANC follows there. So to conclude my brief introduction here, this of course raises fascinating questions about multi-party democracy and what is accepted as consolidated in South Africa, and how we often, and I found I often have to look, and when I do look beyond the formal, beyond the officially recognized tier of politics and policy, when I identify these other players, these other types of activities, I find I come out so much wiser, understanding better, perhaps sometimes why things happen, but if not why, then at least all the dimensions along which politics is playing out. And perhaps this is something that is true all around the world. We see so much of the formal politics supplemented by the informal politics. I think what makes South Africa more unusual is the fact that of proportionality, as a fact of what I see as the widespread diffusion of informalization, of parallel politics, of supplementary streams of political action, characterizing South African and South African ANC politics. Thank you, Mzu.
Thank you, Susan, for those opening remarks. Fascinating the comment you made about the many owners of the ANC, or many ANCs rather. It kind of conjured up an image of an organization that has moved from a single source or single roots or single owner to a franchise. So it seems you're depicting an ANC that is now a franchise. Anyone can just buy a franchise and hide behind the banner and do their own thing that departs from the original idea. So that's very interesting. I just have a question structured in multiple parts on President Ramaphosa. The first is that Ramaphosa, you make some points about the popular ratings that he notched, especially after NASREC victory. Now let's take a step back and locate Ramaphosa within the canvas of what was the ANC presided by President Zuma. He lent a hand to President Zuma in Mangaung in 2012 in outmaneuvering President Kgalema Motlanthe as ticket. And he agreed to support the Zuma faction, and he was rewarded with a deputy president. Why is this development not so prominent in our analysis of Ramaphosa's role in the factional dynamics of the ANC, especially during the Zuma era? The second one is, of course, his role in the state as the deputy president. He had presided over the war room as during the power crisis in South Africa. So he played a key role in state processes that became, that went on a tailspin, and that led to rather sterile outcomes with respect to Eskom and its ability to turn the tide around. And thirdly, he was instrumental in presiding over the disciplining of the ANC Youth League when it called for the nationalization of mines in 2011, and which led to the formation of the Economic Freedom Front. How big a role did President Ramaphosa play in as part of the Zuma machinery? And finally, on the advisory structures and various other commissions, can you convincingly show the impact? Because you say this enables him to govern effectively. How do we assess the impact? Are there examples that you can show that gives us a picture of the deliberations in these structures and how the decisions in these structures then translate themselves into governance outcomes?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for those questions. Yes, in the first place, there are many ANCs. There certainly could be an ANC for everybody, but then people also look at the predominant one. To what extent is there space to tolerate? To what extent can people often just step aside and say, let the other ANC play out? And I think the notion of many different little ANCs is fine for those people who have been in the struggle, who have always been part of the ANC, who truly will never find another political home or do not see themselves outside of this broad tent at any time. So it can work for them. But in other cases, as we had in the case of state capture, we really saw people mobilizing against the Zuma must fall campaign that came about and was actually very, very effective, started off quite white, but they mushroomed out, included unions, included political parties like the EFF, marching around the streets of Pretoria in the end. And those were very, very effective and helped push ANC in parliamentary caucus in the end, not to vote with that thing that is apparent, it's very anathema nowadays, not to vote with the enemy like in the DA, but to actually make a stand and show that there was a significant proportion of the ANC, even in parliament at that stage, who were prepared to go for the alternative. So there is also, it's a balance and a tipping point where people really say in the ANC, it cannot go any further. They either stand up, like we've probably seen in the ANC in the last few weeks, stand up and take charge. Do not just play the long game that, the Cyril Ramaphosa's long game and hope in the end it will pan out okay. But stand up and take a stand and ensure that the ANC that people actually want prevails. And so, yes, there are limits to the different banners of the ANC and how much space there is at what point one faction has to rise up and say a line has to be drawn, although too many lines have been drawn in the sand by now. And Cyril Ramaphosa, of course, is a very important factor in this equation. You rightly point out that Mangaung, he was a crucial player there. When Kgalema Motlanthe took the principal decision to stand aside and not to come on board, where the Ramaphosa's, where the Zumas wanted to get Motlanthe on board as part of the Zuma ticket, Motlanthe stepped aside and Ramaphosa became available. That was a very compromised position and a compromising act that he took there. Excuse me, just a sip of water here. But if Ramaphosa had not done that, there would probably have been a very different ANC in a different relation to power at this point. So it is such a dilemma, it's such a vexed question as to whether Ramaphosa should have been there, could have made a different, could have played a different role, taken a different trajectory. We know at that point it was already clear. It was clear to the ANC after the Cope split, basically in 2008, started after Polokwane in 2009, that should another modest breakaway occur, it would not retain that outside majority, that outside chance to get an outright majority. And it came very close to other splits on several occasions. It is probably also clear to the so-called RET faction that there is not much of a chance for it to gain the upper hand should it step outside the ANC. And that is where these balances continue playing out. But to return to Cyril Ramaphosa, yes, indeed, he had a big role in the stands on expulsion of the former ANC Youth League, also people who became subsequently the EFF. So he has really played an ambiguous policy role, and many people point out to many contradictions that continue to surround him. And that is being used in various ways as ammunition against him as well, where there are many questions as to how clean is he. We know the allegations of party funding, of internal party funding, and of these campaign at Nasrec. That's old news by now. Big important question is whether it actually misled Parliament in that process. So, and those little skeletons and bigger skeletons will continue hovering. But in the overall game where his opponents come with so much baggage of corruption and other misdeeds, allegations and charges at this stage, but where the lines are drawn along those crass lines of criminality and capture and abuse of state resources, then it seems that there are degrees of what is acceptable and what becomes the high road, quote unquote, in the ANC or not. And just to turn to Mzu's last point on policy and advisory bodies, now each of the advisory bodies and commissions really come with their own story and with their own prospects. In many cases, they can play a role, they can give valuable advice. In other cases, they are really used as legitimation, to be seen to be inclusive, to be seen to be consultative, but perhaps in the end, not making a profound contribution. And like we have seen on land, so many other recommendations there have not been taken on board. They can be taken on board very, very selectively. We also see some of that coming up now on task teams, like a task team on the electoral system, for example. Are the outcomes truly open? I hope they are, that there can be change if and only if change is really necessary. So many different options. So there isn't just one clear-cut answer, like yes, they make a big difference or not. In many cases, they have been sitting on the shelf, commission reports, for example, hopelessly until, in some cases, Arms Commission we've seen until it was thrown out legally. And we haven't seen a replacement for that. The Zondo Commission is a question in own right. Perhaps the overall final report is not going to be that definitive in terms of clear cuts. Now this is the bridge, now we're on the other side of the bridge. But even just to the extent that the hearings and the confirmation of so much that has already been alleged through in-depth, sometimes journalistic in-depth investigations before that, it has already made a big difference in that respect. So each of these really, really different, but there's no doubt, especially when there are internal state structures, a whole government department perhaps, that cannot be entirely trusted. Maybe they're still old guard, maybe they're not qualified enough, but have to be kept on board for their salaries, because if they're kicked out, they will not help the current government to take decisions forward. Maybe there is space for a balance, but each one really in it has a different story, and very often it helps Ramaphosa and his new government. You cannot clearly cut out the previous government. Those shadows still persist. It helps them take new decisions. Thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne. I'm going to pose questions from the participants, and we are also processing the questions from our audience on live Facebook, and also some that are coming through emails. The first is a question from Garth Lepierre, a friend of mine here in the platform. he asks a question whether we, whether the ANC was ever ready to govern a complex society and economy that South Africa is, and especially since, as he says, under President Ramaphosa, the triple challenges of the weaknesses in the state and the party, the economy and society are becoming a lot more glaring. What does this tell us about the ANC's readiness to govern? You'll remember the 1992 document, the ANC Ready to Govern. The second question is from Wouter van Zyl. He says that Ramaphosa gives this idea of a long road, that he's on a long game, and he has to move slowly to resolve these challenges. And a critical mass have brought to this. Don't criticize President Ramaphosa. He's playing a long game. He has an ace card behind his pocket. So he kind of critiques this view, and he suggests that President Ramaphosa is part of the institutional decay of the ANC, and he wants your view on that. And he also asks if the president has the support of the South African Defence Force. And lastly, another friend of mine, Kabela Matlosa, he poses a question about South Africa's foreign policy and whether you address this in your book, and how has this shifted from Zuma years to under Ramaphosa, and how, what are its characteristics, and finally, should all these problems be attributed to Ramaphosa's weaknesses versus weaknesses in state capacity, that is the institutional weaknesses that the state faces, institutions that were eroded under President Zuma. What would be your take? We'll check other questions, and hopefully we'll have one final round before we wrap up.
Okay, great. Thank you, and thank you, colleagues, for the questions. Yes, Gus, indeed, whether there is a readiness to govern a complex society. We so often see that policies are announced and there then says, oh, the policies are great, but it's the implementation that is lacking, or perfect implementation that's lacking. But indeed, I don't go along with that argument that it's just implementation that's lagging. Otherwise, good policies can only be good. There's no point of having a policy if it is not implemented. It's only then that it can be good policies. And we have seen so many policies, and that is an ANC strategy in governing, and trying to show that it is governing this complex society that we are. And I actually believe it does so less than what it says. Many, many laudable plans, so many strategies, so many new iterations on old and on new strategies. There's an endless list. And that is often given as evidence that there is action, the pronouncements of new initiatives and uses of these phrases, we must have this and we will do that. And so often it's not coming to fruition. The policies are critiqued very often, very valid critiques coming forward. We do not often see the bulk of those critiques being taken on board. And it could be that very much pointed towards the end of the circle of this batch of questions, that of state capacity. There may simply be not be sufficient capacity to do this, but there's also often not political will. And things like phenomena like state capture certainly don't explain everything, but it went quite some way towards explaining quite a few of the deficits, and not just the resources that were disseminated inappropriately, but also resources that just did not make it, were not allocated, appropriations that were not done with the necessary circumspection, with the necessary insight. And there's a big debate forever and currently as well on state capacity and what can we do to improve state capacity. We've seen at local government level, I refer to that district development model being brought in, but just ensuring that policies are being seen through. And that is why there's even a very destructive public policy debate at this stage. What does it matter if they say, for example, if land policy changes, if we get that much needed better land justice going in South Africa? Because if government couldn't implement previous policies, what about the next batch? There is a hint of truth here and there if one takes the sting out of that and the inappropriate judgment out of it at some point. But it is truly a point of capacity to do things. And so, yes, Garth, that 1994, 1992 dream, ready to govern, that became the campaign platform for much of 1994. That was so much of that still remains to be implemented. The ANC always has got enough evidence of progress, of markers being put down to be able to say, we have delivered that, we have done that, but that gap, addressing that gap is so often just not forthcoming. And that is a question of not being, in many respects, not ready to embrace fully those challenges of governing a complex society. And I link that immediately to foreign policy. And it's interesting how foreign policy has and has not changed between the different presidencies, Kabele. Because, yeah, under Zuma, we really, in some ways, Zuma was seen as the antidote to Mbeki, former President Thabo Mbeki, with his excessive emphasis on reaching out, being the iconic leader on the continent, etc., etc. After Mbeki, Zuma came and had much more domestic focus, and in some ways, people welcomed that because they were also looking for a reconnect, but that euphoria also did not last very long, and Zuma became on one, and I say this with tongue in the cheek, one place where he really reached out was when it came to the Russian nuclear power deal. That was very, very close, or South Africa had that. If he had been in power for a few more months, we probably would have had major new commitments, contracts to nuclear deals that would probably have been challenged in a constitutional court if constitutional court had not been subject to simultaneous delegitimation efforts at this stage too. So, but yes, and under Ramaphosa, yes, we have seen a bit of a rise in profile in the AU, but not much so far. But yes, it is more of an international outreach there. There was a question of whether Ramaphosa plays this, how he plays this long game, and whether this is truly a game or whether it is a shield behind which to hide for not enough to be done. We know Ramaphosa is supposed to be playing, and we see when people define this long game that Ramaphosa outmaneuvers, that's how the argument goes, that he strategizes, he negotiates. We've seen him pin everybody down in negotiation, in drawn out gains, eventually materializing, probably, in other respects, absolutely not. And whether this is a substitute for not doing things and not getting things done, and not getting things done in time. Because so many things do get done, but do not get implemented, and then simply do not get done, it is very difficult to draw that specific line. I think he too often hides behind doing this, and in the longer term, we know he's very good at negotiation, bringing people on board, always negotiating people. I've heard that phrase being used, negotiating people into submission. And he certainly is good at doing that. It becomes less credible when ANC, NEC after NEC in August last year, there was a line drawn in the sand in negotiations with the Magashule people, and much more broadly than that, people who do not want to step aside because of wrongdoing. And just recently, 2 weeks ago, we saw another line being drawn in the sand. And one can only imagine that there is progress, that this is a firmer line in the sand. And we know that in the interim, in that period, there's been much negotiation, deliberation, fleshing out of guidelines for stepping aside, bringing the Integrity Commission in contact with the NEC. Those steps have been taking place. And perhaps that is the point where the RET faction may be subdued in terms of if the NEC statement of 2 weeks ago, a bit more than a week ago, was a sign that the long game is necessary and to deliver some fruit. In that specific respect, I would say, yes, it has done something. It has given progress, but it definitely runs the risk of being so long and so drawn out, especially if there isn't more definitive leadership coming in very soon, especially should the RAT faction continue discrediting ANC in the sense that it's not the only group of people who have been implicated. Many others have gone on board into the Ramaphosa faction because they want to escape scrutiny and because they want to buy political safety. So if this action now is a sign that there is more definitive action on leading the ANC from the front, then one could say, yes, this long game was credible and it delivered results. If it is still just another postponement and not just another way to make sure the ANC is not divided to the point of split, probably not split, but splitting or fractioning, then there would be big questions continue to be asked about whether that is really a definitive and legitimate way of governing, or whether it is a Ramaphosa who is trying to get possibly a second term. We haven't heard the final word or any much of a definitive word on that yet. We know that he is the presidential candidate that has the strongest public standing and the strongest public approval ratings, and that he will possibly be a strong candidate should the ANC want to retain in current conditions, and flaws and all, and question marks about his leadership and all, and past histories and his alliances to capital and all. But if he remains a strongest candidate, then he will probably see that going into a next round of leadership elections, despite the factions proposing special conferences and a special status NGC or hijacking NGC, National General Council meeting, for political gain. But those are struggles that we'll only see playing out in the next few months, and probably in the period between now and first by the end of April, when that 30-day period for stepping aside runs out, and second, whether the NGC, National General Council meeting, takes place and it has a focus on policies and state capacity instead of just another faction fight that substitutes for inter-party contestations. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. I'm afraid we we ran out of time right there. There were a couple of questions that you could continue to think about, such as the reference to this public policy making through protests, its implication on governance in the future. That was from Takalani. Ronesh Dawaraji had asked a question about whether the President Ramaphosa is one-term president and what are the implications. I think you've answered some of these. And TK also, TK Pue, colleague, also asked a question on beyond Ramaphosa. Who are we likely to have if Ramaphosa is not in power? But right there, we ran out of time, and I want to thank you, Susan, and again to thank Veronica and Corina, the team from Wits University Press, for giving us this opportunity to have this discussion. And many people who've stayed on throughout this talk, and very lively questions that came through from Facebook and the Zoom Live platform. All the best with this book. It's a wonderful book. We don't want to give too much away, so we won't prolong this discussion. Get it on Amazon, on Loot, on Take a Lot, or on Kindle. All the best on the book tour, Susan. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. And thanks to everyone. We're now closing the discussion.
Thank you.